Hello, it's Dr. Coates again. It is Thursday the 18th, and this is relatively late at night. I'm not any happier about it than you are, I imagine. But it is my duty to give you the second lecture on language poetry, which I would like to do right now. So I'll do this, and then I'll send this out to you in an email, which will have a few words about the group illustration project, especially in terms of the technology I'd like you to use. Which I would like to expand a bit from the Pinterest decree that I made earlier in order to make it more capacious in terms of the different options that you have. Especially if you've done a lot of work with Prezi, I don't see any reason to stop you from doing that now. Okay, so I'd like to start off by reminding you how the last lecture on this subject ended, since it deserves full attention and explication, so I'm quoting myself here. The meaning of a language poem will always be related to a concurrent implicit claim that poetry is not just a humanist genre designed to convey information, meaning, and cultural interpretation from one person to another. Poetry to the language poets is also a way of exploring what language is, and how we are all just as much the servants of a common tongue, whose contours shape and control our thoughts, as we are skillful manipulators of our own unique meanings. That's the end of the quote. Now, earlier on in the course, I told you about the intentional fallacy, the idea that it was foolish to think that the author of a text has full and total control over the meaning of the artwork, since none of us as human beings is ever in full and total control of ourselves. We have unconscious desires that can manifest in unintentional verbal slips or nervous tics, and besides, none of us can claim to be complete masters of our consciousness 24/7. Part of the time we're asleep, or if we're awake, we're very tired, for example, or insufficiently focused on the issue at hand. The intentional fallacy was developed in response to the poetry that was written at the beginning of the 20th century. Language poetry was written in response to that earlier generation of poets, and to the criticism that tried to understand them. The language poets take it as a given that nobody controls language, and that the word must precede the thought for the thought to occur in the first place. To that extent, much of what we think is the product of our own minds is a function of a communal, shared discourse that we all possess and are possessed by. We are all interconnected, and we influence each other perhaps more than we can ever be aware of. This does not mean that a language poet surrenders the attempt to express her or himself in poetry, but they never attempt to claim full mastery of that meaning. In fact, I would argue that they create situations that foreground the futility of thinking that any one interpretation can somehow trump or vanquish the rest of them. This has a lot to do with the playfulness I spoke about on Tuesday, because they had surrendered the high seriousness of trying to mint new meanings. What was left to poets of the post-World War II generation was primarily the delight rather than the responsibility related to language. Often a language poem disrupts the conventional boundaries of poetic genre. As for Lynn Hegenian's poem, The Lost Pines Inn would be a good name for a motel, which is on the Blackboard site for weeks 2-3, which is not so much a prose poem as a poem that has a lot of prose in it. As if it forgot that it was supposed to look like a regular poem. Or consider the excerpt from Susan Howe's My Emily Dickinson, her book, in which she basically gives us an analytical reading of Dickinson's My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun, that poem, thus blurring the essay and the poem genres together. But it's also true that the sort of playfulness that is displayed by language poems is often not easily recognizable as playfulness by you or me. It's a poem playing with your expectation, often provocatively, often, as I said Tuesday, impishly, which of course suggests imps. Sure, usually not your friend. Let me demonstrate this through a sustained double reading, that is, a reading first of the poem and then through the poem with my margin comments in mind, of Susan Howe's That This, a poem whose title contains what we call a deictic, which is a pronoun for which there is no immediately discernible antecedent. So in other words, that this, what does that or this stand for? Maybe we'll find out, maybe we won't, most of the time when you have a pronoun, you should be able to figure out what it's standing in for, as you know. The poem also fitfully embraces the standard convention of capitalizing the beginnings of poetic lines. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't capitalize them. Doesn't really seem to be a rhyme or reason for that. There's also no rhyme. Okay, so here is the Howe poem. Day is a type, when visible objects change, then put on form, but the antitype, that thing not shadowed, the way music is formed of cloud and fire, once actually concrete, now accidental, as half-truth or as whole truth. Is light anything like this? Stray pencil, commonplace, copy, as to one aberrant, onward gliding mystery, a secular arietta variation. Grass angels perish in this harmonic collision, because non-being cannot be this, not spirit, not space finite, not infinite to those fixed, that this millstone as such, quiet which side on which, is one mind put into another, in us, unknown to ourselves, by going about among trees and fields in moonlight, or in a garden to ease distance to fetch home spiritual things, that a solitary person bears witness to law in the ark, to an altar of snow, and every age or century for a day is. And then it just stops. So here we go again, and this time what I'll try to do is to pause as I'm, it's kind of like a meta-commentary, in this case the reader was me, about what I'm reading, okay? So, day is a type, when visible, and in my margin, a type of what? Objects change, then put, and I have got change into what, you know, put on form, but the antitype, and I say, is the antitype night, or some different day? I mean, are we talking about Monday, but maybe Thursday is much different? That thing not shadowed, the way music is formed of cloud and fire. That thing, formed, but the antitype, is the antitype night? Oh, a day that isn't bounded by night. A day that goes on forever. When does this happen? I guess it happens the same time when music puts on the form of cloud and fire. Actually concrete, now accidental, as half-truth or as whole truth. Ah, a metaphor for something which is decaying or ending or dissolving, right? Concrete becoming something accidental as a half-truth, right? You know, going from whole truth to half-truth is kind of like something which is decaying from truth statement to slightly less true. But not a lie, because that would be the opposite. That would be the antitype. Is light anything like this? Stray, pencil, commonplace? Wait, are you asking if light is like writing? Because you could say that easier. One commonplace copy as to one aberrant onward gliding mystery. Then I say, perhaps a reference to illumination caused by another person's writing. A secular arietta variation. And an arietta is a small aria, which is a song, usually sung by a woman, in an opera. So then my margin comment is. But writing, poetry I take it, is also like a song. Grass angels perish in this harmonic collision because non-being cannot be this. And I say, the this in the poem's title may be death, or non-being, ceasing to be. Not spirit, not space finite, not infinite to those fixed after death, or perhaps this is the poem once it's written, kind of frozen into place in a particular form. The speaker doesn't believe consciousness can be bounded, so it's not going to be as small as some finite space. But it can't be infinite either, because you couldn't be able to talk about it. So the soul has to be something which is identifiable and therefore bounded in some way, but you wouldn't be able to think about it being bounded in the same way that the body is. Kind of an odd stanza. That this millstone as such, quiet whose side on which, is one mind put into another. And my margin comment, one mind writing to another is like stones grinding up wheat, although we may not realize the influence of others on us. And then back to the poem. In us unknown to ourselves, by going about among trees and fields in moonlight, or in a garden, to ease distance to fetch home spiritual things. I think to fetch home spiritual things is why one would read a poem, to fetch home spiritual things. But it has to be over a distance. And by the way, metaphor, as many of you probably already know, is taken from two Greek roots, meta and phoros is to carry, so, and meta is distance. So a metaphor is literally to carry over a distance, to take one thing that you're substituting, a word that you're substituting for a concept, or person or thing, and to carry it into a text by means of this vehicle, this metaphor. So finding an apt metaphor, perhaps for revelation, is a metaphor itself for the writing of a poem. That a solitary person bears witness to law and the ark. And here I'm thinking it has to be the Ark of the Covenant, which held the tablets which, by the way, only Moses was able to see. I don't know if you remember your Old Testament, but he goes up to Mount Sinai and receives the two tablets with the Ten Commandments, and then breaks them, and they get put into the ark. But he's the only one that has this revelation, has this communication with Yahweh. And so, when he explains to the rest of the Israelites, this is what happens, these are the rules we've been given, they have to sort of trust on faith that what he's saying is what he was actually told. And then the last stanza, an altar of snow in every age or century for a day is, and my margin comment here is, it just stops. There's really no ending whatsoever. Okay, so now I'm back to my lecture. Where does the snow come from at the end, and for what purpose is it placed there? I take it that the title serves to get us thinking about not only what happens when words stand in for other words, as pronouns do with their antecedent nouns, but also when a poem stands in for an individual's revelation, as happens any time somebody who has inspiration sits down to commit it to paper, in the hopes of conveying it to somebody else. The hope of the author must be that the reader will respond to that idea, but since the process of one mind put into another is somehow akin to a grinding millstone, taking wheat kernels and making them into flour, it's not as though... that is a fairly violent image for communication, and even then that influence may remain unknown to ourselves, as the poem has it, for an indefinite amount of time, perhaps. It's not as though the poet can expect immediate reactions from the reader. In fact, the way we read an altar of snow at the end is connected to whether or not we feel that the attempt to create a poem that puts form onto visible objects, as it says in the opening lines, was successful. An altar of snow could be ephemeral, something that's fleeting, that's here today and then gone the next day when it's much warmer, as all non-glacial things built of snow turn out to be, or antithetical, because the Ark of the Covenant was always associated with fire, or as it says in line 6, cloud and fire. And if you replace that with snow, you're talking about opposites now. Just as near its beginning, the poem kept lingering on what it called antitypes, something and then the thing it isn't, the whole truth and half-truth. It's a pretty confusing poem, in other words, which may or may not have confidence in its own or any poem's ability to convey the fruits of the imagination to any reader out there. A harmonic collision might be the bust-up that betrays the failure of poetry to portray revelation, or it could be the result of poetry's success of portraying revelation, especially since communication is a millstone, and if you have a revelation, like it's talking to God on Mount Sinai, right? I don't know why you would expect that not to be a violent, I don't know why, if you try to put that into a poem, you wouldn't expect that to have a violent collision with its reader, because of the strength of the revelation that you're trying to portray. The process of this poem seems to be to invite the reader in, even from the title, this, and you're wondering, what does that stand for? Simultaneously intrigue and repulse the reader with leading imagery and odd combinations, and then to stop suddenly and suggestively. It's an odd combination of poetic intensity and academic detachment. This is itself a pretty good metaphor for language poetry, which is written by, mostly poets who also teach at university, and have been reading a lot of literary theory in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. That is the end of this lecture, and it's actually the end of all the new content for this course. Next week I'm going to be giving you 2 different lectures about how to study for the final exam. So Tuesday you can expect to hear all about the ins and outs of what the exam will look like. It will be comprehensive over the entire course, but because there hasn't been a chance for me to test you on the 5th module, we'll also focus much more on Module 5 than on the other 4. Okay? But fear not, I'll be talking with you in depth. And I'd also like to schedule a time when we can all get on Twitter together, something like simultaneous tweeting, as if it were a review session. So please be thinking about what types of questions you might like to ask me and your fellow classmates, and then we'll try to find a time when most of you will be able to get on Twitter. But I think I can at least promise that I'll find 2-hour blocks. So even if you're not able to make one of those, if you tweet me a question in between the first and the second, then I'll be sure to respond to it in the second one, okay? But anyway, by Tuesday of next week, I'll let you know when those times will be, so that you can plot it out and see if it's possible to rearrange a schedule if you have a really hectic class and work schedule, which I know some of you do. Other than that, though, thank you for watching these lectures. If you've been watching them or reading them in your in the transcripts. And stay tuned for a little bit more information about what to do for the group illustration project in the email I'm sending this out in. Thank you.